Is NIO stock under attack by Jim Cramer and his gang? Speculation around Bitcoin and China's influence and what Peter Thiel is saying about it. News around Tesla China, big numbers, but also has Tesla a problem with China? And then stuff like the ongoing saber rattling between US and China, as well as my views on the current markets and what I'm doing with my stocks in portfolio, for instance, like Baidu, Tesla, NIO, and SAP and so on. All these things in one quick video for this weekend, so please smash a quick like, and this helps to spread the news around that more people can watch it. And then let's dive into it. What the hell is going on with Jim Cramer? Recently, he was tweeting that NIO, the Chinese Tesla, isn't as good as Tesla, which now is the Chinese Tesla. So enough with NIO, it's had a great move, but why trust the country's Tesla? I really had to reply here and say, like, people who think NIO is the Tesla of China are really scratching just the surface. Both will do fine and coexist. Different business model and different positioning and propositions. I hope, Jim, that you are watching this channel, because here you can definitely understand and learn more about the differences and what is actually going on in China with both companies. I mean, come on, Jim, you've been the one who've been saying before, like, NIO is the Tesla of China, which in my point of view is totally not the case, but making such kind of comparisons, and in the past actually even to hype up NIO as, you know, the newcomer after Tesla, that doesn't help both in the downward direction as well as in the upward direction in my point of view. And I think this is really my main takeaway here. Jim has both been late to Tesla as well as to NIO. He came around later on hyping the stock, but it's all about show and entertainment. There's no real value behind it. But he is certainly on an agenda here, or onto something, because he made a couple of tweets in the last couple of days. NIO boosters, mighty quiet, haha. And then even one bearish tweet about NIO, which he actually deleted. So don't get me wrong, I don't think that Jim has any influence on NIO share price here, and that's certainly not what's driving down NIO stock price in the past days, and it's also not putting too much pressure on it, I guess. But I wouldn't totally rule out that he is onto something here with some kind of an agenda, maybe helping somebody out, maybe somebody who has shorted NIO, because right now, to be honest, it's quite an easy target. So he's just being opportunistic here. NIO has obviously been in a downward trend, and that's due to various reasons that I have covered here on the channel. The tech rotation, the Chinese issues with US-China relations and so on, all those put heavy pressure on NIO. And now it's maybe quite easy to make a couple of bucks on this downward trend. Notably, by the end of March, the short selling volume of NIO had kind of an uptick there, which is maybe a little bit significant. But generally, my main takeaway here would be to be really cautious about those, media gurus that have an opinion, sometimes popular and in your favor, but sometimes really not in your favor. But they're being just opportunistic, and no matter in which wind their direction blows, they're going for views, they're going to shape the public opinion. And that's not necessarily helping out retail investors in my point of view, because he's got a massive reach there. And well, actually, you need to buy low and sell high and not the other way around. So what is the significance now of pushing down NIO right now? It doesn't make sense to me. Okay, enough about Jim Cramer. I think he will come back to his senses and, well, join the NIO revolution once things are looking better again. Back to a different topic, this time Bitcoin and China. And we have some quite interesting commentary here by Peter Thiel, the PayPal co-founder. And his comment, I think in the beginning, was quite misunderstood, but let's watch it first.
From China's point of view, they want to get, they don't like the US having this reserve currency, because it gives us, a lot of leverage over, Iranian oil supply chains and all sorts of things like that. They don't want the renminbi to become a reserve currency, because then you have to open your capital account and you have to do all sorts of things that they really don't want to do. I think the euro, you could think of as, was in part a Chinese weapon against the dollar. It didn't, the last decade it hasn't quite worked out that way, but that was, China would have liked to see two reserve currencies like the euro. And, even though I'm sort of a pro-crypto, pro-Bitcoin maximalist person, I do wonder whether at this point Bitcoin is also should also be thought in part as a Chinese financial weapon against the U.S., where it threatens fiat money, but it especially threatens the U.S. Dollar, and China wants to do things to weaken it. So it's sort of China is long Bitcoin, and perhaps from a geopolitical perspective, the U.S. should be a little bit be asking some tougher questions about exactly how that works. But some internal stable coin in China, that's not a real cryptocurrency. That's just that's just some sort of totalitarian measuring device.
And I found this comment spectacularly interesting because first, it was misunderstood by the common press and media. So some bears on Bitcoin were arguing that actually China could come and destroy Bitcoin because they own lots of the hash power. So that's what Peter Thiel meant by China is actually long Bitcoin, because although Bitcoin is banned in China, there's lots of mining happening in China. And so actually Bitcoin reacted negatively to it and went down -3% after those comments. But he actually made some quite smart comments here, which is actually that, well, when China is long Bitcoin, actually, why isn't the US? And I completely agree with that. After I went long Bitcoin in late 2020, and then also Tesla and Elon Musk joined, I thought, and I made a video about it, that I think it was a brilliant move actually by Tesla to do this, because this is kind of a unique differentiator for Chinese companies. It's quite hard to actually take on Bitcoin onto the balance sheet, and thereby Western companies can actually profit from this appreciating asset over time. If you're a Bitcoin bull like me, and assuming that Bitcoin will still continue going up from here, because then, for instance, companies don't have to dilute their shareholders. Instead, they can make additional funds by the Bitcoin assets that they have on their balance sheet. And that's difficult to do maybe for China. But now the question here is also what will happen now with the rollout of the Chinese digital currency, which is, in my point of view, not a real competitor to Bitcoin, because Bitcoin has various technical setups that are much more preferential than the Chinese DCEP. I'm going to do a deep dive on the DCEP topic in particular. But in my point of view, the value of Bitcoin is that it is about freedom, it's about privacy, it is with a limited monetary supply. All of this the Chinese DCEP doesn't have, right? And so any government-issued current digital currency wouldn't have that. So actually, it would be a smart thing to do, actually, in terms of that the West is actually embracing and going long Bitcoin as a counterpart to this Chinese digital currency in a way, because in the end, this is something which is not in line with the values of China and also their authoritarian regime in terms of how they manage the freedom of not only their citizen, but also the monetary freedom in the country and beyond that. So, Bitcoin is actually a good hedge there. And now with this commentary by Peter Thiel, I think he makes a good statement, and he kind of mentions how urgent it would be actually for Western governments to actually joining this movement, because otherwise, well, what I think will happen is that if the governments don't join it, well, the people will. I think people will increasingly invest in Bitcoin, companies will invest in Bitcoin because the values are just so strong in comparison to what is out there in comparison to that. So long story short, really important comment here by Peter Thiel, which hopefully fosters some thinking also more on this macro global political level, how Bitcoin can play a role there, especially in contrast to what China is doing. Anyways, going to do a separate video as a deep dive on that later on. Because in general, this really ties into what we're seeing right now with the new Biden administration. There's lots of new saber rattling in the US-China relations, a new government coming into force, so they need to play with their muscles, kind of juggling their different arguments against each other and balancing out and finding new arguments ultimately on how they want to settle in this US-China trade and other issues. And these kind of saber rattlings and ongoing tensions are affecting companies, for instance, like Tesla, who's wondering like whether or not the Chinese government is going to do something in counter. And of course, it has big effects currently on stuff like the delisting fear and in general, Chinese stocks taking a deeper hit.
I think the last administration, love him or hate him, Trump had the right policy. Chinese understand the stick. So we've got to get more aggressive. We've got a level playing field. We have to use the stick, get extremely aggressive to level this. And maybe at the height of this, delist their stocks off the exchanges in America, stop them from getting access to the courts because we don't have access to theirs, and really push hard to level this out. Now, I am a bit of a hawk on this, but I live the reality and have for 5 or 10 administrations that have done nothing. So, sorry, I'm not happy.
Do you see it escalating to that point?
Sorry?
Do you see it escalating to that point?
I hope so. Because I don't think they play by
So you can see, because of those issues going on, some people are calling for a tougher stance against China. And it's funny to see, because this is an investor, and if you look at part of their funds that they are selling, I mean, they have big Chinese holdings, so he's essentially arguing against his personal holdings here. But, well, it's fair enough. There are issues in this China-US relations, that's for sure. I agree. Western companies are treated less preferential in terms of the Chinese counterparts. There are big barriers and hurdles for trade for Western companies. There are rules in China that make it hard for Western companies to do business and so on. I felt it personally with our startups selling German goods into China. It's something that is there for sure, but I just think that the response to it is actually the wrong one. I think the response shouldn't be a decoupling, it shouldn't be a delisting of Chinese stocks and so on. It's rather that the West should actually have a deeper understanding of China, actually more invested in China, in Chinese companies and so on, and hopefully also more Chinese companies in their countries like the US and Germany and so on. Because in my views, this would actually give the West far more leverage over Chinese politics in the end, except for this current ongoing decoupling, and that China is going back beyond the Great Wall, the Great Firewall, not only the internet firewall, but also, the Chinese wall. That doesn't make sense to me. For China, it's easy to be self-sufficient within their own borders. Instead, we should actually think how we can reap also some fruits of the growth and the prospects of China growing for years to come. And also Chinese companies hopefully investing more in Germany and the US and elsewhere. And I take the example of Tesla here. A couple of people are quite concerned around whether or not Tesla has a problem in China. We had some issues around Tesla cars being banned close to military facilities in China. Also, there's the question whether or not Tesla can actually sustain its market share in China and such. And to sum it up in a nutshell, no, I don't think the Chinese government will go against Tesla. I also think, yes, they will do everything for NIO in order to be able to compete with Tesla, but they will not try and shut out Tesla out of the country, and they want Tesla to be successful, and Tesla will have good government relations with China and will be successful there. That's my views, because in the end, that's also good for China. And actually, that's my argument here, where I think the West should actually do the same. We should be keen on having NIO investing in car factories in the US and start selling in the US, because then finally, we also have the same cards in the deck if there is a new tension going on, that NIO certainly wants to have access to the US markets as well. And now, then suddenly we have the EV subsidies in the US, which benefit Tesla, just like the EV subsidies in China are mostly benefiting NIO and so on. So, this is kind of the counterbalance that we would need: more competition within our borders, and thereby more economic connectedness, and also hopefully prosperity for both. And in that context, let me give you a quick update on the Tesla China numbers. In my last video, I didn't have the China-specific numbers, but now I have them. So Tesla sold 25,000 Model 3 and 10,000 Model Y. These are mind-boggling numbers. So even on the Model 3, they increased the month-over-month production and also deliveries. And now Model Y is ramping quickly, delivering more than actually NIO in the same month. So that's really bullish, and that's really good to see that the Model Y is being accepted so fast. However, I need to say I'm quite unsure how many of these cars are actually getting registered in China. Maybe some of these are getting exported to other countries. So I have to wait for the license plate registrations in order to get clarity on that, but it shows you how well Tesla China is doing, at least in terms of production. And they also have now the Q1 over Q4 growth. That's something spectacular. Only NIO also achieved that as well. So this is really a way to look at it. Both NIO and Tesla can do just fine. NIO obviously in an earlier stage of their scaling, and Tesla, here the king of scale at really big numbers. So for wrapping things up here, a look at the markets in general and also some insights on what I'm currently doing with my positions. So first off, if we look at Nasdaq with all of the technology stocks, we see that Nasdaq is back at all-time highs, and that feels kind of strange because my personal portfolio is still in the red, and that has to do that I mostly invest in those really fast growing high-tech stocks that have almost startup-like character, and those stocks are mostly still beaten down, as well as Chinese stocks in particular. So far it's stocks like Apple, for instance, or particular Microsoft and Facebook, like the big tech giants that have reached even new highs here or are recovering really quickly. So these are the big market caps and let's say the less risky stocks in those tech areas, the big FANG stocks. And that's really what's driving the overall indexes here like Nasdaq or S&P 500 and so on. And if you are comparing that, to instance, for an index here like Crane Shares that is tracking Chinese tech internet stocks, you can see that how far they're still down. That might be around 30%, even 26%. Not much of a recovery lately. And that really shows you how this rotation is affecting a certain type of stocks and category. And this actually also shows you like how steep this run up that has been quite unusual was in the past in the Chinese stocks, for up to 35% plus here in this index. And of course, like for some stocks like NIO, that was even more like in the almost in the hundreds of percent that it has risen. And now obviously the question is what to do with that. Will it come back? When will it come back? And so on. So as pointed out in my previous videos about this whole US-China issue, as well as the interest rate issue and the rotation about tech stocks, I mentioned that this is just a macro event and that is a tech rotation that at some point will also end again. And I cannot put a date on it, but what I can tell you is what I'm currently doing. So first of all, I'm not selling most of my growth stocks. I mentioned that I sold off some more speculative positions, for instance, Space, ticker Space, Virgin Galactic. And on top of that, also companies which I thought that have really run up too high, like Futu brokers and so on. But I'm also kind of copying a little bit the ARK Invest approach here right now, that I'm now selling off something that is perceived more like value or more conservative growth stocks like Microsoft, Merck, and Roche, which have been not doing so great in comparison to my growth stocks previously, but now haven't done quite as bad as these stocks. And now with this new capital, I can now start and do a little bit of shopping around, because now some of the valuations have come down. And I mentioned previously, maybe you've seen it on Twitter and also in the Patreon community, that I finally got into Futu stock around the $100 mark. I also added to my Tiger position because I actually think that Tiger is actually undervalued in comparison to Futu, although it's the more risky position as well. I nibbled on some NIO around $37. As I have a really huge NIO position, obviously, that's just adding a tiny bit of percentage here. But I still think, now that it is coming down, it's good to dollar cost average a little bit more here. Will I be able to time the bottom here? I don't know, frankly. I also have got some comments who think, well, I should have sold NIO when it was at $67 a share. But my view is here, it doesn't make much sense to sell it for me right now, because I have this long-term outlook. I think NIO will be a triple-digit billion US dollar market cap, the first in China, coming from China as a global brand. It will be a textbook study case for future MBAs, they will see that this was the point when China went from being the workbench of the world to a new type of country which produces innovative companies that can succeed at a global stage. And I think NIO will be the major case for that, to be honest. And so I see a bright future for NIO here. And if I would have tried and sold it right now, I would only have to pay taxes. And then will I be able to time the bottom exactly and go back in 100%? I doubt that. I'm not smart enough to do that, to know exactly, time it and have this little difference then that I can make between the 50% that it's sold off and the 25% that I have to pay in taxes. So for those stocks that I'm convinced and that where I see a bright future ahead, I just keep on holding onto them and then add a little bit whenever I think it makes sense. The only new position that I have found so far this year is XNet. As I mentioned before, Xunlei is kind of a speculative play as well, but it has worked out quite well so far because in Q4 the numbers have been actually quite good and are making the case for what I see in this company. So I'm holding on to this one, but be aware that I haven't done much due diligence in this company yet. But judging from the earnings call, it sounds to me that there is more positive news coming from this company. And I still think that this is a low valuation to get into. And that's particularly what I'm looking for. I'm looking for future growth at low valuations. And now that valuations in many of these risky tech growth stocks have come down, I think now it's the time to maybe pick up some of these stocks, because ultimately I think not the high interest rates and not this continued rotation from growth into value as a reopening play will be sustained over time. Stocks that deliver a healthy growth will actually also succeed in terms of the stock price. Yes, some of these companies have lots of catch up to do with the valuations, but the valuations have now also been going down a bit. So it's getting more and more attractive actually to look more at these companies again. And as always, my approach here is quite risky. That doesn't mean that you have to follow it, but I'm talking publicly here about what trades I make, how I see the markets and the companies that I invest in. And I hope it gives you some perspective, some due diligence, and also some insights of the way I'm actually managing my portfolio here. Speaking of that, what's more to come? Yes, I'm certainly looking for more new investments where I can now start new positions. As I mentioned before, right now in 2021, I haven't done much new entries yet besides XNet. But now I'm seeing more and more opportunities, some in my current positions. For instance, after Bill Huang's hedge fund blew up and they had to sell off lots of Baidu shares, I added to my Baidu position as well. I think this is a quite unique opportunity there. I'll possibly do a separate video on my case on Baidu. I think it's tremendously how nicely valued it is currently after this big run up and now this bust because of the hedge fund issue around there. Actually, there might be further trouble around it because now the banks are kind of tightening the margins. So that means maybe some more hedge funds that are trading on lots of leverage need to sell off some positions. So that may actually give more pressure on some of those speculative plays. Maybe even NIO could be affected from that as well. But ultimately, that's giving us opportunities, or for me, certainly, these are opportunities to find new positions to add on, or ultimately also adding on to some companies. One company that I'm currently not adding to is SAP. I've mentioned before how the Q4 earnings have been a disappointment in my point of view. Now, SAP was also part of this big sell-off. I don't think there was any particular company news affecting and related to that. I have now a big position in SAP as always. I haven't sold a share, but I'm also now cautious of adding more to it, given this macroeconomical downturn right now and giving the size of my position in this company. And also, as I'm only expecting that this can only actually come back in Q3 and Q4. So with that, please check out my Patreon link down below, in which I'm gonna post the new NIO business Excel sheet and the case study where I think NIO will go into the next coming years, how to value it, what are gonna be the financials and so on. And then for those of you who are interested in my trading signals and updates on my portfolio, make sure to join at least a NIO gang tier on Patreon in order to get invited into the community feature of my Patreon supporters. So with that, happy weekend. Thank you guys for watching and see you in the next one.